Hello everybody, welcome back to a brand new video, and I actually use new sparingly as I have previously, because if you were there for it, you'll know that this is technically a re-upload, but it's more of a remake, because I figured that I need to build a stronger foundation to build this channel upon. So therefore, I am remaking all my previous videos in a higher quality. So that being said, today's topic is actually secession, and whether or not it is legal. So let's get into it. All right, fellas, you see, today I'm actually going to be discussing why the South, why the Confederacy actually had the legal and just right to secede from the Union. You see, once upon a time, we had these things called slaves. Alrighty, nah, I'm just kidding. So, firstly, what is secession? Well, there's two different types of secession. One of them is the separation of land from one state to form another state. And you've probably heard of some of these movements in the news, such as the movement for Eastern Oregon to separate from Western Oregon, to join Idaho, who they feel they are more politically aligned with, to form Greater Idaho. God save the United States of America if Greater Idaho ever comes into existence, even though I low key support it. And there's also another funny example where Maine separated from Massachusetts. Now, I don't know if you guys are students of geography or not, but Maine is not connected to Massachusetts. But for some reason, it's a chunk of land that used to be owned by Massachusetts until they sold it to the federal government to repay some kind of debts. I don't know. It's a little confusing. But that's not the kind of secession I'm talking about today. The kind of secession I'm talking about today is actually when a state voluntarily withdraws from the United States, from the Union. And that's like if Texas or California were to leave and be like, hey, we're forming our own country. That's the type of secession I'm talking about today, and it's usually regarded as an illegal action and is the basis of the United States Civil War. So, is it illegal? Effectively, yes, it is illegal, as much as I'd love for Florida to be its own country. However, a strong case can be made for its legality. But even if it was legal before the Civil War, a long-standing precedent has been set that it is illegal. So I actually have a quote here from the late great Justice Antonin Scalia, where he states, "If there was any constitutional issue resolved by the Civil War, it is that there is no right to secede." So, all that being said, is there any argument for its legality? And yeah, there's actually quite a few. Number one is the 10th Amendment. And if you don't know what the 10th Amendment is, it basically states that powers not enumerated or delegated to the federal government and not prohibited to the state governments are powers possessed by the states. And this argument basically rests on the fact that secession is not banned in the Constitution, and there are no statutes or legislation that ban secession. So therefore, it's actually a power that the state governments have. So therefore, because secession is not expressly prohibited, it is a power of the states. Well, here's another argument for secession's legality. That party little man you see on the right there is actually former president of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis. And this argument essentially rests on the fact that Jefferson Davis was never prosecuted. And if he were prosecuted, he planned to argue that secession was legal. And it's not that he wasn't prosecuted because maybe they couldn't prove that secession was actually illegal. And maybe if he was prosecuted, he would have to go before a sympathetic jury who would find him not guilty. And the implications of finding that secession was actually a legal act after the Civil War had already been fought are pretty bad. Like, can you imagine all those people dying in the Union winning the war and then being like, hey, secession is actually legal? Like, that's not something that you want. And also, there was a lot of reconciliation after the war. People wanted to mend ties between the North and the South, and prosecuting the former president of the Confederacy isn't a way to reconcile or to mend ties. So there's actually quite a few arguments against its legality. Number one is the Articles of Confederation and perpetual union between the states. So part of the Articles of Confederation states that our union shall be perpetual. And I know what you're thinking. Wasn't the Articles of Confederation replaced by the Constitution? And the answer is yes. And when the Constitution actually replaced the Articles, it made no mention of any kind of perpetual union anywhere. However, legal scholars, nevertheless, still interpret our union to be perpetual. which we'll see in the case we're about to discuss, Texas v. White. And here we go. Texas v. White. This was a case where Texas had war bonds or some kind of government bonds that were sold by the Confederate government to raise money. And after the war was over, Texas went to court and they said, hey, technically secession is never legal, so those bonds shouldn't have been sold, and we want our bonds back. So this is basically Texas selling out their homies just for some money. And, it's kind of funny. But this case ruled that legally Texas and no other former Confederate state left the Union from a legal point of view because secession was illegal. And this ruling was actually based on the perpetual union established by the Articles of Confederation. And I know what you're thinking. How can you make a judicial ruling based upon a document that doesn't govern America anymore? And you're right, it's a very finicky ruling when you look at it like that. And they actually made that ruling because essentially, even though there is no mention of a perpetual union in the Constitution, the Supreme Court interpreted that the drafters intended for that perpetual union to still be in place. And this one important factor when looking at this case is that it actually only held unilateral secession illegal. So, what's the difference between unilateral secession and bilateral secession? Well, to put it simply, unilateral secession is when only one party agrees to secede. So, that would be like the Civil War. The South agreed to secede, but the Union did not. They did not want to let that happen. But a bilateral secession is basically when like two parties, both parties involved, agree that going their separate ways is for the best. So think of like Czechoslovakia, where the Czech Republic and Slovakia separated and they both mutually agreed to it. There was no war, there was no bloodshed, there was no conflict. They both said, hey, we agree to separate. That's a bilateral secession. Or think about like the United Kingdom releasing India or Canada or Australia as fully fledged independent nations. That would be a bilateral secession. So I want to discuss maybe this was a politically charged ruling. So this ruling came out in 1869, and again, like I've discussed with Jefferson Davis going before a trial, the implications of finding secession to be legal after the Civil War are pretty bad. So therefore, it's likely that in this case, especially with them relying on the Articles of Confederation, a document that doesn't govern us anymore, that this was a largely politically charged ruling because it was simply made to bring the nation together and to essentially squash any doubts that the Civil War may have been unjustified from a legal standpoint. And it's important to note out that some legal scholars have said that this was a bad law, a bad ruling, but just about everyone has defended the ruling, saying that it was necessary for the time period. Alrighty, so I went ahead and I made my webcam a little smaller so you guys can see this chart that I put up. It's not really important, but it's a little interesting to look at. And I actually got this chart from Georgetown Law School. So I want to talk about the importance of precedent. Now, let's talk about case law, because case law is law that is based upon legal rulings rather than statutes or the Constitution. So case law is basically law that is based on precedent, past legal rulings. And case law is considered law just like any statute, just like any amendment in the Constitution, and that's important to know. So, simply put, Texas v. White has been set as precedent, and it's been that way for about 160 years now, and as such, it is now part of case law. And we also have to discuss the legal topic of stare decisis. And stare decisis is basically a legal principle saying you should decide cases according to precedent. And whether or not stare decisis has any kind of binding authority depends on the issue and depends on the court. And you can actually see that on that little chart I put up there from Georgetown Law. It tells you, depending on the issue and depending on the court that something is in, what other rulings from what other courts have binding authority on whatever ruling that court can make. A little confusing, but it's not that hard to understand once you look at it for a little bit. And my point basically is that precedent and case law are effectively law, even if that case was maybe ruled wrong at the time. Like I said, that case may have been politically charged, but at this point, it's precedent, and that makes it law. So here are some of my final thoughts. Secession may have been legal at one point, but case law dictates its illegality now more than anything, even if that case law was politically charged. The only time secession will ever be allowed, more than likely, is if the federal government allows it. So, like I've stated, bilateral secession may still be illegal. If the United States and the state of California mutually agreed to part ways, that may be legal, but we've never seen that happen. Unless you count the Philippines, but they weren't really a state. It's a little complicated. I mean, the Philippines kind of was a bilateral secession situation. So, yeah, I guess we do know bilateral secession is legal. We just don't know if it's legal in the context of states. So, ultimately, states have no right to unilateral secession, and secession is illegal. So, thank you guys for watching. Like I've said, I'm a brand new channel, so everything you guys do for me goes a long way. So if you could please like and subscribe and leave a comment, maybe if you have any ideas or suggestions, please do so. It really helps me a lot. And thank you guys for watching, and I hope you guys have an amazing day.